10 Second Edition News, brought to you by Mobil.
This is the 10 Second Edition News with Ann Fulwood.
A column of tanks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tanks moving toward the Kremlin right now, rumbling down Kutuzovsky Prospect, a main street in from the western part of the Soviet Union. Tank treads churning up the pavement here. A bright sunny day in Moscow, a sad day for the people who are supporting reform.
Good evening. After 6 years in power and being responsible for the dismantling of hardline communism, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev was ousted today. US President George Bush, just a short while ago, said Gorbachev's demise had serious consequences. Tanks and armoured vehicles from the military and the KGB have taken control of Moscow's Red Square, and the entire Soviet Union's been placed under a state of emergency. As for Mr. Gorbachev himself, he's reported to be under house arrest at his holiday home in the Crimea. The latest details now from Molly McCoy at CNN headquarters.
Hardliners say they have replaced Mikhail Gorbachev as president with Gennady Yanayev, the conservative vice president. And one report says that Gorbachev is now under arrest at his vacation home in the Crimea. That report of Gorbachev's arrest comes from a spokesman for Boris Yeltsin, the reform-minded president of the Russian Republic. Yeltsin himself is denouncing Mr. Gorbachev's ouster and is calling for a general strike to return Mr. Gorbachev to power. But at this hour, the hardliners who engineered the overthrow appear to have physical control of the capital. Soviet troops and armored personnel carriers are now in the streets of Moscow. You're looking at live pictures, and reinforcements are reported headed for the Kremlin. There are no reports of shooting, but one unconfirmed report says a leading reformer was seized by two men outside the Russian Parliament building and was taken away. The announcement of Mr. Gorbachev's ouster came about 6 hours ago from the TASS news agency and Soviet television. It came as Mr. Gorbachev was on vacation in the Black Sea, one day before he was to sign the Union Treaty with heads of 5 republics. In an initial statement, Yanayev said he was assuming the president because Mr. Gorbachev was unable, for health reasons, to perform his duties. A state of emergency was declared for 6 months throughout the Soviet Union, and in its first decree, the hardline Communist Committee that seized power said it would clamp down on the press, it would ban demonstrations, and impose a curfew anywhere it encountered resistance. That committee said the KGB and the Interior Ministry had strong powers to carry out its orders and prevent what it called fratricide and civil war.
Many in Moscow woke to these extraordinary events with the sound of tanks rumbling along city streets. Exclusively on the 10 network, America's cable news network described the dramatic scenes as they unfolded.
We're on the roof of the building in which the Bureau is. This is the first time that we have seen tanks in the streets. They're heading down Kutuzovsky Prospect in the direction of the Kremlin. In about 2 minutes, they'll be going by the Russian Federation building where Boris Yeltsin has been giving a news conference. He has called this an illegal act, saying he was unable to speak to Mr. Gorbachev this morning, saying that he would never be removed by anything but the people of Russia who elected him. A column of tanks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tanks moving toward the Kremlin right now, rumbling down Kutuzovsky Prospect, a main street in from the western part of the Soviet Union. Tank treads churning up the pavement here. A bright sunny day in Moscow, a sad day for the people who are supporting reform.
Steve, as we watch that picture, we're now going to go to some other pictures. In fact, a recent statement just moments ago, the first statement by Russian Federation President Boris Yeltsin, the first statement he made in the hours after Mikhail Gorbachev's resignation as president was announced. I believe we now have that statement from Boris Yeltsin.
I had no luck in getting through to President Gorbachev. I was not given a chance. All mass media, meaning television and radio, are under special control of that group. Just now on the radio, they declared the decree number 1 of that committee. The very order, the very decree, consisting of, I think, 9 points, tells us where the adventurers want to push our country, to get the people in the element of lawlessness, which not once took place in our country.
Governments around the world are still coming to terms with today's events. US President George Bush was woken soon after Moscow's announcement. He was immediately briefed by officials from the Pentagon and the State Department. A short while ago, he held a news conference saying all the US can do at present is wait and watch developments.
Clearly, it's a disturbing development. There's no question about that. And it could have serious consequences for the Soviet society and in Soviet relations with other countries, including the United States. President Gorbachev is clearly an historic figure, one who's led the Soviet Union toward reform domestically and toward a constructive and cooperative role in the international arena. And it's important to keep in mind the enormous changes that have taken place towards openness, towards reform, the changes in Eastern Europe, the newfound cooperation with the United States and others in the Gulf, and many other areas. There's a whole new era of cooperation. I don't know whether to take heart or not from Yanaev's statement that this does not mean turning back the reforms, but there was such a statement made by him. So the situation is still quite murky inside the Soviet Union. There's very little we can do except to reiterate in total cooperation with the European allies our commitment to these principles of reform and openness and democratic change. And that's what we are going to continue to do. I've indicated that business will not be business as usual because we will not support economic aid programs, for example, if adherence to extra-constitutional means goes forward.
There seems little doubt that President Gorbachev has been removed from power by an unconstitutional seizure of power. There are constitutional ways of removing the President of the Soviet Union. They have not been used. Whatever the future may hold for President Gorbachev, I hope there is no doubt in anyone's mind about the immense contribution that he's made over recent years, both to the prospects for people within the Soviet Union and for the rapprochement that has taken place between East and West as a result of his efforts and those of Presidents Reagan, Bush, and others.
Mikhail Gorbachev has been the leader of the Soviet Union since 1985. He won enormous international support for helping to end the Cold War and moving the stagnant Soviet economy towards a Western-style free market system. But all the time, hardliners were waiting for their chance to hit back. Only last weekend, Gorbachev received a warning from a former ally.
Mikhail Gorbachev's hold on power, always precarious, was undermined still further 3 days ago when his chief advisor, Alexander Yakovlev, resigned. Yakovlev, the acknowledged architect of perestroika, issued a chilling warning that a neo-Stalinist grouping had gained control of the Communist Party and was preparing a coup to stop Mr. Gorbachev's reforms.
Reactionary right-wing forces are preparing to stage a victory at the next party congress to get rid of all reformers and to publicly humiliate General Secretary Gorbachev.
Yakovlev's reaction was to join Edward Shevardnadze, who also warned of impending dictatorship before tendering his resignation last December. His decision to form a new democratic movement challenging the Kremlin leadership stripped the Communist Party of all its leading radicals and left Mr. Gorbachev even more isolated. Perestroika unleashed another problem that has threatened the very fabric of the Soviet Union, the demands for autonomy from 6 of the republics. Unrest and defiance became the order of the day, and one after another. Characteristically, Mr. Gorbachev took the bull by the horns and went to Lithuania himself to hear the demands at first hand. And he left no doubt about his objections.
I am very perturbed by the tendencies in parts of our country, including here, towards secession, separation. This cannot be permitted. This cannot be permitted.
It would seem no coincidence that today's developments have come on the eve of the signing of a new union treaty, negotiated by Mr. Gorbachev, which strengthens the powers of the republics which have said they'll accept it. And always over his shoulder, he had to watch the rise and election to power of his great rival, Boris Yeltsin. But at the heart of all Mr. Gorbachev's problems was the Soviet economy and his attempts to open it to capitalist influences and Western aid. He came to the G7 summit in London looking for help and to reinforce his position as a world statesman. He was offered political goodwill instead, and now it seems he's lost his battle to force through reforms and his position on the international stage.
When we return, our coverage of the coup in the Kremlin continues with the reaction from share markets to Bob Hawke.